He packed his bags on a Tuesday. Not a Friday, not after a fight, not after some dramatic blowout that would at least give the moment some weight. A Tuesday, while I was making chicken soup on the stove. While the smell of thyme and bay leaves filled every corner of the house we had shared for 26 years. While I hummed something I couldn't even name, just some old melody my mother used to hum when she was doing dishes. He walked into the kitchen with 2 suitcases, and a look on his face I had never seen before. Not guilt, not sadness. A relief. I'm leaving Carol's. That was it, 3 words, after 30 years of marriage, after raising 2 children together, after burying his mother and mine. After the cancer scare in 2019 that I thought would break us but instead, or so I believed, made us stronger. 3 words, and then he was gone. But here's what he forgot. He forgot who I was before I became his wife. My name is Carol Diane Whitfield. I was born in a small town in Ohio, the second of 4 daughters, raised by a woman who could stretch a dollar so thin you could see through it, and a father who worked double shifts at the mill and still found time to read to us on Sunday nights. I was not a woman who needed saving. I want you to understand that, because by the end of 30 years, I had forgotten it completely. And I think that's exactly what Richard counted on. I met Richard Whitfield when I was 24 years old at a company picnic in Columbus. I was working as a financial analyst for a mid-size insurance firm, a job I had fought hard for, studied harder for, and was genuinely good at. I wore a blue sundress that day. I remember because my sister Dana told me I looked like I was trying too hard, and I told her I was absolutely trying hard, and there was nothing wrong with that. Richard walked over with a paper plate of potato salad and a crooked smile and said, "You look like the smartest person here." I told him that was probably accurate. He laughed, and I thought, this one is different. And for a long time, he was. We dated for 2 years, married in June of 1994 in a small ceremony outside Columbus, under a white tent with string lights and a borrowed arch covered in white roses. My dress cost $200, and I altered it myself. Richard cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. My father shook his hand so hard Richard winced. We were happy. I want to be honest about that. The early years were genuinely, deeply happy. We moved to Cincinnati for Richard's job. He was in sales, building materials, the kind of work that required travel and charm and handshaking, all things Richard was naturally gifted at. I transferred to a smaller firm and kept working. We bought a house that was too big for 2 people and painted every room ourselves over 3 weekends, arguing about colors and laughing about it by dinner. Then came our daughter, Emily. 1997, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, and a scream that could have shattered glass. Then our son, Daniel, 2000, quieter than his sister, watchful. Even as a baby, he seemed to be studying things. And somewhere in those years, in the blur of school lunches and soccer practices and parent-teacher nights and birthdays and Christmases, I made a decision. I decided to step back from work. Richard's career was accelerating. He was traveling more, earning more, moving up in ways that felt exciting and important. And someone had to be the foundation. Someone had to be the one the kids came home to. Someone had to make sure the house ran, the appointments were kept, the meals were made, the laundry was done, the permission slips were signed, the dentist was called. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that for 11 years. By the time Emily was in high school and Daniel was in middle school, I had been out of the professional workforce for over a decade. I did some bookkeeping for a neighbor's small business. I helped another woman in our neighborhood with her taxes every spring. Small things. Things I could do from home. Things that didn't interfere with the structure of our family, which was, by then, entirely built around Richard's schedule, Richard's needs, Richard's career. I didn't resent it, not then. I loved my children with a fierceness that surprised even me. I loved our house, the creaky third step on the staircase, the kitchen window that looked out over the backyard where the kids had worn a bald patch in the grass from years of running. I loved the rhythm of our life, even when it was exhausting. I thought Richard loved it too. I thought we were a team. There is no single moment when a marriage starts to fall apart. Nobody tells you that. You expect a blowout, a discovery, a scene, but what actually happens is quieter and crueler than that. It's the way he stops asking about your day. Not dramatically, just gradually. You notice it one evening, then forget about it. Then you notice it again a week later. Then one day you realize he hasn't asked about your day in 3 months. And when you try to tell him something anyway, his eyes drift to his phone before you finish the sentence. It's the way he starts referring to money as my money. Not our savings, not the household account. My money like a slip, like something he forgot to disguise. It's the way the family dinners change. Emily left for college in 2015. Daniel followed in 2018. And suddenly, it was just Richard and me in that big house with the creaky stair and the bald patch in the backyard that had finally grown back over. Just the two of us. And Richard seemed bothered by that. He started working later, traveling more. When he was home, he was distracted, not hostile, not cruel, just absent, like he was already somewhere else in his mind and his body hadn't gotten the message yet. I told myself he was stressed, work pressure. He was in his mid-50s by then, and I knew he was feeling it, the younger guys coming up behind him, the industry changing, the quotas getting harder. I made excuses for him the way I had always made excuses for the difficult things in our life. I smoothed them over and moved on. I suggested counseling once. He said, "We don't need a stranger telling us how to be married." I suggested a vacation. He said he was too busy. I tried new recipes, rearranged the living room, bought new sheets, started wearing perfume again, little quiet attempts to reach him. Small flags I was waving that he never looked up long enough to see. And then his mother got sick. Margaret Whitfield was 81 years old, sharp as a tack, and as stubborn as any person I have ever known. I loved her. Genuinely. She had been kinder to me than some of my own family, and when she was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition in early 2020, I didn't hesitate for a single second. "She should come live with us," I said. Richard looked at me across the dinner table. Something moved across his face that I couldn't read. "Are you sure?" he said. "Of course," I said. "She's your mother, she's family." And so Margaret moved into our guest room in March of 2020, right as the world was shutting down, right as everything got harder and stranger and more uncertain. I became her primary caregiver. Richard was working from home by then, but working from home for Richard meant locking himself in the office from 8 in the morning until 7 at night and emerging only for dinner. I managed Margaret's medications, her doctor's appointments via telehealth, her daily needs, her moods, which were difficult as the condition progressed. I cooked for her separately because her diet was restricted. I sat with her in the evenings and watched her programs. I held her hand when she was confused and scared and didn't know where she was. I did this for 2.5 years. Margaret passed in September of 2022. I held her hand at the end. Richard was on a work call. I didn't say anything about that. I filed it away in the same place I filed all the other things, the growing collection of moments I pretended hadn't happened. After Margaret passed, I expected something to shift. I expected grief to crack Richard open a little, to bring him back to me, back to us. Grief does that sometimes, reminds you what matters. Instead, Richard became a ghost in our own house. He started going to the gym early in the morning, which was new. He bought new clothes, which I noticed but didn't comment on. He was more careful about his phone, Not hiding it exactly, but tilting the screen, turning the volume off, taking calls outside on the back porch with the door closed. I noticed. I'm a financial analyst by training. I notice patterns. I notice when something doesn't add up. But I was 61 years old, and I had been out of the professional world for decades, and I had spent so long trusting this man that my instincts felt rusty, unreliable. I second-guessed myself constantly. You're being paranoid, Carol. He's just stressed, Carol. You're seeing things that aren't there, Carol. And then my daughter, Emily, came home for Thanksgiving. Emily is 26, sharp and perceptive in ways she gets from me, though I've never said so. She noticed things within 48 hours that I had been explaining away for 2 years. "Mom," she said, finding me alone in the kitchen on Thanksgiving morning while her father was, again, on the porch on his phone. "How long has he been like this?" "Like what?" She gave me the look, the one that said, "Don't play dumb with me." I said quietly, "please don't." "Mom, I'm serious. Something is wrong." "Everything is fine," I said. And I turned back to the pie crust I was rolling out, and I did not let myself cry until she went upstairs to unpack. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I found the credit card statement. Not through snooping, I want to be clear about that. I had always managed our household finances. It was one of the small ways I had gained a foothold in the thing I used to be good at: numbers, organization, the language of money. The statement came in the mail, as it always did. I opened it, as I always did. And the charges didn't add up. Hotel stays I hadn't been told about, restaurants I'd never been to, a jeweler in downtown Cincinnati, florist charges to a delivery service. I sat at the kitchen table with that statement for a long time. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I just sat very still and looked at those numbers and understood with terrible, quiet clarity that I had been a fool. But here's the thing about being a financial analyst, even a lapsed one, even one who spent decades making pot roast and signing permission slips. I know how to follow a paper trail. I didn't confront Richard right away. That was the most important decision I made. Every instinct in my body wanted to walk into that office and throw that statement across his desk and watch his face. But I made myself wait. I made myself think. Because I had a feeling, a cold, specific feeling that I can only describe as financial, that if I confronted him too soon, I would lose the advantage of knowing. So instead, I started looking. I have always had access to all of our accounts. Joint checking, joint savings, the investment accounts we'd built over the years, my small IRA from my working days. Richard had his own business account for work expenses, but I had his login information because I had set it up for him years ago and he'd never changed the password. I started looking. What I found over the next 3 weeks made me feel like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. The investment account we had built together, the one meant to fund our retirement, the one I had contributed to carefully and consistently since we were young, had been steadily drained over the past 18 months, not all at once. Slowly, carefully, in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. $200 here, $500 there, $1,500 in another month, deposits into an account I didn't recognize. I ran the numbers 3 times before I accepted what I was seeing. $231,000. Gone. I sat with that number for a full day before I did anything. I just carried it around with me. I made dinner. I folded laundry. I watered the plant on the windowsill that had been there so long it had become invisible, just part of the furniture of our life. $231,000. Then I called my sister Dana. Dana, who had told me I was trying too hard in that blue sundress at the picnic 32 years ago. Dana, who had become a paralegal and then, in her 40s, gone back to school and become a licensed attorney. Dana, who I had not burdened with the details of my marriage because I was too proud, or too ashamed, or too afraid of what she might say. She didn't say, "I told you so." She said, "Carol, listen to me very carefully. Do not touch anything. Do not move any money. Do not say a word to him. I am coming over tomorrow and we are going to figure out your next step." She paused. "And Carol, I need you to go pull every financial document you can find. Tax returns, account statements, property records, everything, tonight." I spent that night at the kitchen table with a flashlight and a cardboard box, pulling documents from the filing cabinet in the office while Richard slept upstairs. My hands shook that night. I had been sitting on everything I knew for 4 weeks when Richard walked into the kitchen with his 2 suitcases. By that point, I had met with Dana twice. I had consulted, through Dana, with a divorce attorney named Patricia Owens who specialized in high-asset marital cases. I had documented everything I'd found, organized chronologically in a binder Dana had labeled, in her precise paralegal handwriting, Whitfield Financial Records. I had stopped accessing the joint accounts because Patricia advised me to. I had opened a new account in my own name only and moved my own small savings there. I knew things Richard didn't know I knew. And when he walked in with those suitcases, I turned down the heat on the soup. I turned around, and I looked at my husband of 30 years. "I'm leaving, Carol," he said. He had a speech prepared. I could tell by the way he was breathing, slightly rehearsed. "This hasn't been working for a long time. We've grown apart. I think we both know it. I'm going to stay with a friend while we figure out the legal." "Okay," I said. He stopped. "Okay," he repeated. "Yes," I said, "okay." He stared at me. He had expected tears. Maybe begging. 30 years of being the foundation of someone's life, he expected me to crumble when it was pulled out from under me. He blinked. "I'll have my attorney reach out." "That's fine," I said. "Mine will be ready." Something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, just a flash. "You have an attorney." "I do," I said. I turned back. To the stove, I stirred the soup. He left. I listened to the car back out of the driveway. I listened to the sound of it disappearing down the street. I stood at that stove for a long time, stirring soup I didn't intend to eat. And then I called Dana. "He's gone," I said. "Good," said Dana. "Now we begin. Here is the thing about a man who spends 30 years watching his wife make soup. He stops seeing her as a threat. He forgets that the woman humming at the stove used to sit in a glass-walled office and analyze risk for a living. He forgets that she spent years understanding the language of money before she ever spoke the language of school lunches. He forgets that the mind doesn't atrophy just because you stop using it in the way others can see. Richard forgot all of that. It was the most expensive mistake he ever made. Patricia Owens, our attorney, was 63 years old, compact, precise, and carried herself like someone who had heard every version of this story and was no longer surprised by any of it. She wore reading glasses on a chain and took notes in a shorthand I couldn't follow. She was, without question, the most competent person I had sat across a table from in 20 years. At our first formal meeting, she laid out what we were dealing with. Richard and I had been married for 30 years in the state of Ohio. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but fairly based on a long list of factors including length of marriage, each spouse's contribution, and economic circumstances. The $231,000 that had been moved out of our joint investment account was documented, traced, every transfer recorded. "Dissipation of marital assets," Patricia said, writing the phrase on her notepad. He spent or moved marital money for non-marital purposes. That money doesn't disappear in the settlement. It gets counted as if it's still there and counted against him. I absorbed that. There's more, she said. Over the next hour, Patricia walked me through what her forensic financial consultant had found after I handed over our documents. Richard's business account, the one I'd had access to and he'd never thought to change, showed a pattern of moving business income in ways that reduced what appeared on paper as our marital income. He had, over 4 years, quietly restructured his compensation arrangement with his employer to defer a significant portion of his earnings. Earnings that would be his alone after the divorce was finalized, since they were technically future income. He planned this, I said. Patricia looked at me over her glasses. Yes. How long? Based on when the financial behavior changed, approximately 3 to 4 years. I did the math. 3 to 4 years ago, right around the time I was caring for his mother. Right around the time I was cooking her restricted meals and holding her hand through her confusion and sitting with her in the dark when she was frightened. While I was doing that, he was planning to leave. The room felt very still. What does that mean for us? I said. For the settlement. Patricia allowed herself a small, precise smile. It means, she said, that we have an extremely strong case. Her name was Lynette. I didn't find this out from Richard. I found it out because my son Daniel, who is 25, quiet, watchful, just as he was as a baby, called me one evening 3 weeks after Richard left and said, "Mom, there's something I think you need to know." Daniel had known for 4 months. He had run into his father at a restaurant in Cincinnati, a nice one, the kind Richard used to take me to for anniversaries. His father was with a woman. 43 years old, Daniel guessed. Pretty, well-dressed. His father had gone pale when he saw Daniel and introduced her as a colleague. Daniel hadn't said anything because he didn't know what to say. He had spent 4 months carrying it, and it was eating him. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told him, very calmly. "None of this is yours to carry." "Mom." "Daniel, listen to me. I'm okay. I am handling this. I need you to let me handle it and not worry about me. Can you do that?" A long silence. "Are you really okay?" he said. "I'm really working on it," I said, which was the truest thing I could have told him. I told Patricia about Lynette. In Ohio, adultery is not a criminal matter, and it doesn't automatically change a property settlement, but it is relevant context, and it strengthened the already clear picture of why our marital assets had been quietly funneled elsewhere. Richard, it turned out, had been buying Lynette jewelry. The charges at the downtown jeweler. Pearls, it turned out, I had never owned pearls. In 30 years, I had never once received pearls. I filed that away. Richard's attorney was a man named Gerald Fitch, I think. He was younger than Patricia by at least 15 years, and he had the confident, slightly dismissive energy of a man who assumed he was dealing with a housewife. He assumed wrong. The initial settlement offer Richard sent over through Gerald was, to use Patricia's word, insulting, a modest monthly sum. The house, which we could sell with profits split. A portion of the remaining retirement account. Nothing acknowledging the $231,000 that had already been moved. Nothing acknowledging the deferred income structure. Nothing acknowledging 30 years. Patricia drafted our response over 2 days. I was included in every step. Not as a passive observer, Patricia made sure of that. She explained each element, asked my opinion, incorporated my knowledge of our financial history, because I, unlike most clients she worked with, had actually managed the household finances and knew our assets better than Richard probably thought I did. Our counteroffer was specific, meticulous, documented down to the last decimal. We requested the dissipated $231,000 be added back into the marital estate for division purposes. We requested an accounting of all deferred compensation going back 4 years. We requested my share of the retirement account reflect the actual total, not the depleted version. We requested the house. We requested 20 years of spousal support, not forever, but enough to bridge me back to financial stability while I rebuilt. We also, quietly, noted our willingness to present our forensic financial documentation in court if necessary. Gerald Fitch called Patricia the day after receiving our counteroffer. Patricia told me later he sounded less confident. Legal processes are slow. Everyone tells you that. What they don't tell you is what you do with yourself while you're waiting. I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I went back to work. Not in a dramatic, triumphant way. There was nothing triumphant about it at first. It was terrifying. I was 61 years old. The financial industry had changed enormously. The software was different. The regulations were different. I was rusty and I knew it, and I had to be honest with myself about that. But I called an old colleague from my working years, a woman named Rosalind who had stayed in the field, climbed quite high, and who I had always stayed loosely in touch with through Christmas cards. I called her and I told her simply that I was restarting and I needed guidance. Rosalind said, "I've been waiting for this call for 20 years. Come in on Monday." It wasn't a full-time position at first. Consulting, part-time, flexible, helping Rosalind's firm with some analysis work that required experience rather than just technical speed. The kind of contextual financial thinking that younger analysts sometimes lacked. Pattern recognition, judgment. Things I still had. I drove to that office the first Monday with my hands gripping the steering wheel like I was learning to drive for the first time. I wore a blazer I found in the back of my closet that still fit because I had never stopped taking care of myself, even when I felt invisible. I sat down at a desk, and I remembered who I was. It came back slowly, like circulation returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. Not perfectly, not all at once, but steadily, the language of numbers, the logic of systems, the confidence of knowing how to read a complicated thing and find the part that matters. By month 3, Rosalind offered me a formal part-time consulting arrangement. By month 5, it was full-time. I did not tell Richard. I did not tell Gerald Fitch. I let them continue to calculate my future needs based on the assumption that I was a woman who had been out of the workforce for 20 years and had no path back. They were calculating wrong. Emily came home for Christmas that year. Daniel, too. We spent it in the house, my house, for the time being, as I was remaining in residence while the legal process continued. I cooked the same things I always cooked. The ham and the scalloped potatoes and the green bean casserole from the recipe on the back of the can that we had always made fun of but always ate every last bit of. We didn't talk about Richard much. He had not called his children on Thanksgiving. He had sent Emily a text on her birthday that was, she said, generic. Daniel had not spoken to him since the restaurant encounter. What Richard had not anticipated, or perhaps simply not cared about enough to consider, was that in leaving me, he did not leave a woman. He left a family. He left a woman who was the center of gravity for everything. And when you remove a center of gravity, things don't float free. They collapse. I watched my children that Christmas. The way Emily laughed too loudly at dinner the way she does when she's covering emotion. The way Daniel went quiet when certain songs played that had been family songs, our songs, the kind of songs that get woven into the fab. Rick of a life, and don't stop meaning something just because the life has cracked down the middle. I held it together for them. And in my room, at night with the door closed, I let myself feel it. The grief of it, the loss not of Richard as he had become, but of the idea of him. of the life I had believed I was living, of the future I had assumed was mine. The old age we were supposed to move into together, the grandchildren we'd assumed we'd share, the retirement trips we talked about in the vague, comfortable way you talk about things when you assume you have time. Grief is grief, even when the person is still alive, even when they deserve what's coming to them. I gave myself the nights, and I gave myself the days. 7 months after Richard walked out with his suitcases, we reached a settlement. Richard's attorney had pushed back on several points. Richard himself had, through Gerald, made some ugly insinuations, suggesting my mental state wasn't stable, suggesting my contributions to the marriage were difficult to quantify, suggesting the financial irregularities Patricia had flagged were the result of misunderstandings. Patricia was not moved by any of it. She had 30 years of documentation. She had a forensic accountant's report. She had my intimate knowledge of every account, every asset, every financial decision that had been made in our household since the early 1990s. And she had one more thing. Margaret's estate. Richard's mother had, it turned out, left a will. She had not been wealthy, but she had saved carefully her whole life, as women of her generation often did. Her estate was modest but meaningful. The equity in her small house, a savings account, some bonds, a few personal items. And she had left me something. Not Richard. Me. In her will, Margaret Whitfield had left me her grandmother's ring, a simple band with a small diamond, probably not worth much monetarily, and a letter. A handwritten letter, which her estate attorney delivered to me after probate. I will not share all of it, some of it is too private, but I will share this part because it matters. She wrote, "Carol, I know more about my son than he thinks I do, and I know what you have given this family. I could not have asked for more from a daughter-in-law, and I am sorry for whatever is coming. You are a strong woman, stronger than you believe right now. I am glad I got to know you. Please forgive an old woman who loved her son but could see him clearly. Margaret." I held that letter in the parking lot of the estate attorney's office, and I sat in my car for 20 minutes. She knew. She had known, maybe not the specifics, but she had known the shape of it. And she had tried, in the only way she could, to tell me I was seen. I put the letter in my purse, and I drove to Patricia's office and I told her about it. Not because it was legally relevant, just because I needed to tell someone. Patricia took off her glasses. "Keep that letter," she said. "Put it somewhere safe." The final settlement gave me the house, which I chose to sell, because I didn't want to rattle around in it alone, and because the equity was significant. It gave me a fair division of the retirement accounts, calculated from the predissipation total. It gave me spousal support for 10 years, reduced from my original request, but still meaningful. It required Richard to account for the deferred compensation in the asset division. In total, I walked away with a financial position I had not expected to have. Not because I was vindictive, not because I wanted to punish him, but because it was fair. Because 30 years of holding a family together and caring for his mother and building a life has economic value, even when it's invisible. And Patricia made sure the court understood that. Richard signed in March. I didn't watch him sign, I wasn't there. Patricia called me when it was done. "It's over," she said. "Yes," I said. I was sitting at my desk at Rosalind's firm. I had a spreadsheet open on my screen, numbers I understood completely. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "Thank you," said Patricia, "for being prepared. I need to tell you what happened with Richard, because I think you deserve to know that justice doesn't always look the way you imagine it." 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Emily told me that Lynette had ended things with Richard. I don't know the details, I didn't ask. But Emily, who had reluctantly reconnected with her father at Daniel's encouragement, they felt he was still their father and I supported that entirely because those are their relationships to navigate, Emily told me that Richard seemed diminished. That was her word. Diminished. He was renting an apartment, not the upscale place he'd probably imagined. Something modest, because the settlement had required him to be honest about his finances, and honest about his finances meant his lifestyle had to adjust accordingly. He had, from what Emily described, been expecting a different version of what happened. He had expected to walk away from a quiet, homebound woman who had no financial footing and no professional identity, and who would be devastated enough to accept whatever he offered. Instead, he walked away from someone who had been quietly rebuilding for months before he even walked out the door. That's the thing about underestimating someone. The bill always comes due. Daniel told me some months later that Richard had called him and said something that I think about sometimes. He said, "I didn't know your mother was like that." Like what? Daniel had asked. Like that, Richard said, which was the most honest thing he could have managed, apparently. He meant capable. He meant prepared. He meant still herself. Still, underneath 30 years of soup and permission slips and his mother's hand in the dark, entirely and completely herself. He had forgotten. And that forgetting cost him enormously. I sold the house in September. I stood in the empty kitchen one last time, the window that looked out over the backyard, the third stair that still creaked, the walls we had painted together over 3 weekends, arguing about colors. I let myself remember. Not bitterly, just fully, the way you hold a thing before you put it down. I moved into a condominium 10 minutes from Rosalind's office. Smaller than the house, quieter mine. I painted the living room a shade of green that I chose entirely by myself without asking anyone's opinion, and it is perfect, and I love it, and every time I sit in that room, I feel something that takes me a minute to name. Free. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Happiness is a thing I'm building, the same way I'm building everything else steadily, with the tools I have, without rushing. Emily visited in October and declared the condo, "Actually really cool, Mom," which from Emily is high praise. Daniel came for Thanksgiving, just the 2 of us, and we ate at the kitchen table I'd bought second-hand and refinished myself, and we talked for 3 hours, and at one point we were laughing so hard about something ridiculous from when he was 9 that we both had tears streaming down our faces. That's the thing they don't tell you about starting over at 61. You think it's about loss. And yes, there is loss. Real, heavy, legitimate loss, I won't pretend otherwise. But it's also about recovery. About the strange, exhausting, exhilarating process of finding out who you are when you stop organizing your life around someone else's gravitational pull. I'm still finding out. Some mornings I wake up, and the quiet in the condo feels like peace. Some mornings it still feels like absence. Most mornings, it's both. I want to say something to whoever is watching this. If you are a woman who has spent years, maybe decades, being the invisible architecture of someone else's life. If you have made yourself smaller so someone else could feel larger. If you have told yourself that your value was in your service and forgotten that you had a self before you entered that service. I see you. And I want to tell you what Margaret told me in that letter. You are stronger than you believe right now. I know that sounds like something stitched on a pillow. I know it sounds easy. I know the distance between knowing something and feeling it is sometimes the longest journey of your life. But here is what I also know. As a woman who spent 30 years putting everyone else first, and then had to learn, at 61 years old, to put herself first again. It is not too late. Not to work, not to love, not to rebuild, not to remember who you were before someone else's needs became louder than your own. It is not too late to be exactly who you always were. Richard left me on a Tuesday. He thought he was taking my future with him. He forgot I'd been building one he couldn't see. He forgot who I was before I became his wife. And now I get to remember. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone or of yourself, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know who is sitting alone in a kitchen, wondering if it's too late. It's not,